Welcome to Creation Woodworking. I'm Isaac.
And I'm Caitlin.
And today we're going to be building the wall art you've seen on our Facebook and other social media outlets.
First thing we did was mark 2 foot down on a 4x8 sheet. Use the 8 foot side to get that 2 foot mark. Then I drew a straight edge, and I used this tool that I got at the Home Depot for about $25. It gives me an edge to butt my saw against to get a straight line. It's really essential keeping square cuts. You could use a table saw, it'd be a little bit easier. The next thing that I did was mark 2 foot to the center on the 4 foot side on this backer board. And then I measured from the top and marked 1 foot to get my center point. Then I used a speed square and the square to mark a line up and down and then left and right. It's going to give you something to work off of as you lay down the wood lath. The wood lath is not exactly perfect, as this is a more rustic look. So it's looking more like a farmhouse or like a old style. So having a little bit of differentiation is going to be ideal for the look. But as long as you keep it close to that line, it's going to give you a parallel section left to right and up and down. I also recommend using a pencil as you mark this. Using a pen is permanent, so if you get your line just a little bit off, you can't erase it. And then using Sharpie, if you were to paint over this and not set the wood lath over it, it will bleed through whatever paint that you use. We're going to end up covering your wood lath anyway. I recommend getting a pack of these carpenter pencils. They're only 87 cents at your local Home Depot. The next thing we did was take the wood lath and cut it at a 45. We cut each individual piece at a 45 because it all matched up on that line this way. The next thing we did is set the pattern onto the board. The first method we tried wasn't really working, so we tried a different way of laying it down. We used a brad nailer to hold them in place. Obviously, when we did the next one, we didn't do this step because you have to pull out each individual nail and wood putty them. The next one that we built, we used wood glue, which worked just as well, or if you want to land them on there, you can. The only thing with that is that they do slide around on the board, so as you get it lined up, it's very hard to keep them in place. If you glue just one section in the center, it would make it a little bit easier to hold it. That way you have something to push up against as you lay down each one of these individual pieces. The next thing I did was take a jigsaw and cut off the edge. It's just a rough cut. It's not completely accurate, but just to help the piece be a little bit more manageable. Then I took a sander and sanded it down with 80 and 120 grit. This is not to make it perfect, just to knock off some of the burrs and the edges. Then we use a square and a ruler to mark the individual pieces that would be separated between paint and stain. This is really individual to your custom design, and this is just what we come up with for the one that we did. Next, we took each individual piece, labeling it before we took off the board, and painting and staining it. Allow them to dry before you place them back on, and then put glue on the back and set them in place. Allow the glue to dry before you do any other steps after this. Next, I used a skill saw to cut off the edge and make it square. This would have been a lot easier with the table saw, but this is what I had at the time. The next thing that I'm showing you is cutting off this border. We weren't able to video it while we were making this, but I'm showing you how I made the miters and the frame for this. First, I cut a piece at 45. Then I use this paper that I have and lay it down onto the board, leaving about half of the board exposed and half of the paper on the rest of the board. I use wood glue to hold it down. You can probably use a better adhesive, it's what I have at the time, and it ended up working well for what I was using. You want to leave half of the paper on there and not cover up the whole board. That way the border has something to stick to. Now the board that I'm using is the same diameter as this board that I'm showing you as an example, but obviously with your piece, it's going to have an overhang on the front and the back, so measure that accordingly. Then what I do is use this little extra piece that I cut off of the end to get my miter set correctly. Once I get it set, then I put a bead of glue only in the spot where it's going to touch the board and the paper. You don't want to get too far on either edge because it will squeeze out onto the front of your piece or on the back onto your paper, and it's a nightmare to get off. And the next thing I do is set it on there, and then I'll either clamp it, or if you're like me and you don't want to wait for the glue to dry with the clamp, then I just use a brad nailer to nail it on. If you want to use the clamp and not use the brad nailer, then it'll work just as well. It's just gonna take a little bit more time for that glue to dry.